All right, thank you all for your patience. I really appreciate it. Like Deb said, my name is Merci Melo, and I'm working at UMass Amherst in collaboration with Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. And today I'm going to tell you guys about our American Kestrel Nest Box program, the really cool research that we've been working on over the past couple of years, and maybe some of these management strategies that we're coming up with through our research findings. So for 10 points, can anyone tell me what bird this is? Okay, all right, I gave it away. So this is an American kestrel. And American kestrels have really cool traits that make them a great study species. So first of all, they're top predators. And what that means is that they are at the top of the food chain, and they're going to allow us to learn more about every single branch below them on the food chain. So by studying kestrels, we're also learning a little bit about what their prey species are doing too. So if small mammals aren't doing well, kestrels probably aren't doing well either, because kestrels are dependent on small mammal abundance. Further, they are North America's smallest diurnal raptor, and being a raptor means that they're allowing us to learn more about other raptors that may not be as common as the American kestrel. Most people have seen an American kestrel, but not everyone's seen a northern goshawk. Most raptors have very similar life history traits, so learning more about one can help us inform us about other raptor species. And finally, super cool, they nest in cavities, and more importantly, are man-made nest boxes. So this is really important for studies that involve reproductive success and chick development, because we can really take a peek under the hood physically by opening up a nest box and learn more about chick development, reproductive success, and these other metrics that otherwise would be really difficult to study. And talking about nest boxes, Hawk Mountain has one of the longest running American kestrel nest box programs in the country. So starting in the 1950s, we started putting out American kestrel nest boxes throughout the Kempton Valley, starting with just a couple, but since then we've grown to about 130 kestrel boxes throughout Kempton, Kutztown, Hamburg, and Orwigsburg. So covering quite a few, square kilometers there of area, we're able to study American kestrels this year, as well as look back at long-term trends from the same boxes we had in the 1950s, which is really great for assessing population trends. But besides Kempton, kestrels do live in quite a few other areas. So looking at their range map here, you can see that kestrels are found across the continent, across the United States specifically, during all seasons, but they do move up into Canada and Alaska for breeding season. And they're moving all the way down and migrating into Central and South America during the overwintering season too. So they're covering a lot of ground. And within these areas, they're mostly going to be found in open habitats. So you can see natural meadows here are, of course, a preferred habitat, but they're super adaptable and they're able to take advantage of agricultural landscapes as well. Anytime you're driving through agriculture, if you're looking at the power lines or fence posts, you're pretty likely to see a kestrel. And the most important part about this landscape they live in is that they're able to get the food that they need to survive. So kestrels are going to eat like 3 main prey types. So they're going to eat grasshoppers and other large insects. They eat songbirds that are about the size of a European starling and smaller. And they eat small mammals such as meadow voles and mice. So this is awesome because they're adaptable and they're able to eat and survive in a variety of different habitats, but it also allows them to be our farmer's best friend. So thinking about conventional agriculture, we know that rodents, small mammals, and songbirds are our conventional agricultural pests. So these are the things that farmers are trying to eradicate, or at least reduce the prey abundance or reduce abundance using things like insecticides and rodenticides. This is because rodents are known for consuming grains, contaminating grains, as well as girdling or chewing on the plant stems. Songbirds are known for contaminating grains, and insects, of course, are also going to be chewing on the vegetative tissue of the farmer's plants. But conventional agriculture is pretty expensive when it comes to applying insecticides, pesticides of all kinds. So instead, we can work in a good symbiosis and a good friendship with kestrels by putting up American kestrel nest boxes. So you can see here we have a nest box on a barn, and this farmer benefits from having the kestrel around because that kestrel is going to eat hundreds of small mammals and thousands of insects throughout the breeding season while it's there. So not only is the kestrel getting food, but farmers and all of us, because we're relying on farming as well, we're all benefiting too. But unfortunately, since kestrels are in such a close tie to agriculture, it also kind of leaves them vulnerable to a couple different things. Conventional agriculture, of course, is going to be using these pesticides, which is eventually going to make its way into the food chain. So thinking about those three main prey types that kestrels are eating, the small mammals, we're applying rodenticides to the landscape. So these rodenticides are going to be applied. Rodent populations are going to decline because that's the goal of the rodenticide, right? As well as these rodents are now sickly and easily picked off by kestrels. So kestrels are going to want to eat the rodents that are poisoned. And now the kestrel is not going to feel very well for itself either. There have been multiple studies showing that kestrels that have eaten rodenticides have lower cognitive function. So they're more likely to become predated or potentially hit by cars or colliding into buildings. Very similarly with insecticides, grasshoppers are going to eat plants that have insecticide on them. The kestrel is going to eat the grasshoppers, and now the kestrel has insecticides in their body as well. And kind of similarly, a little more indirectly with songbirds and specifically granivorous songbirds, any herbicides that songbird is picking up, now the kestrel is going to have in their system as well as soon as they eat that songbird, which doesn't make them feel so good. It's not a great thing for kestrels. Like we said, cognitive abilities have been declined due to pesticides, but that's just one thing that we're trying to study and figure out how it's going to affect kestrels on a larger scale. But through our studies, we know that contaminants probably aren't the only issue. So looking at breeding bird survey data, you guys can check out this graph. The direction of the arrow indicates population trends. So downward, kestrels are declining there. Upward, kestrels are increasing. And the color of the arrow indicates a significance or non-significance. So downward black arrows are significant declines in kestrels during the breeding bird survey. And you can see every black arrow is downward. Kestrels aren't doing well, not just here in the Northeast, but all over the continent. Similarly, looking at our hawk migration sites, pretty much everyone is showing that kestrels are declining over time. And this has been happening since the 1970s. Although conventional agriculture has been around since the 70s, we know that contaminants aren't being applied as much, in some locations as they are in others. So thinking about this, Hawk Mountain wanted to put together a project to figure out what's happening to kestrels. It can't just be one thing. So the first thing we wanted to do was to determine what could be causing the decline of such an adaptable raptor that's found all across the continent. So we wanted to see what might be impacting them. Once we figure out what might be negatively impacting them, we wanted to decide or conduct studies to see what was the actual effect. So how do contaminants or prey abundance impact reproductive success or survival and these other population metrics that we're looking at? Once we figured that out, we're also hoping to replicate our investigations across different areas because what's happening in the Northeast, like we talked about, probably isn't the same impact factor over in the West. There might be different parts of the decline that are causing different population trends. And finally, as with any species of conservation concern, we want to figure out what we can do to help. So developing and communicating management plans is one of our major goals. So let's start by talking about how we determine potential causes of the decline. So what could happen or what could be causing a decline of such an adaptable raptor? Unfortunately, there's many things that might be occurring. So we already talked about environmental contaminants, but this might just be one piece of the puzzle. Some of the other things we're thinking about are habitat change. We're all seeing that here in Pennsylvania as warehouses and residential developments are happening so prevalently. This is reducing the amount of habitat kestrels have to forage and find their prey, as well as to nest. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. Further, intragill predation is another concern that we have. So intragill predation is when predation occurs within a group of similar animals that are occupying a similar niche. So for us, we're thinking about how kestrels may be eaten by Cooper's hawks. So Cooper's hawks are a songbird specialist. They're also a raptor. They're competing with kestrels for food. So what is more efficient than eating your competitor? You're feeding yourself and you're eliminating competition. So it's something that we're thinking about. As well as decreased prey abundance is another key factor we're thinking about. As we're applying contaminants to reduce rodent populations or insect populations, that's less prey for kestrels to eat and less food that they're going to be able to feed their chicks and survive year round. And of course, there's a whole host of other things that might be affecting kestrels. So thinking about West Nile virus, it was only introduced in the 1990s. So we know that it's probably not the sole cause, but it is affecting birds of all species across Pennsylvania and throughout other areas as well. Competition for nesting cavities is another big concern. So our kestrels in Kempton happily have nest boxes, but naturally kestrels are going to be nesting in natural tree cavities where they may be competing with starlings or other birds that are relying on those cavities as well. Some others you can look at, collisions with structures and mortality during migration. Of course, as a migratory bird, they're going to face a lot of challenges during migration, including unknown territory where they don't know where the buildings are. And if they're migrating at night or if they're migrating in low light or bad conditions, there might be collisions. So all this to say, a lot of things might be happening all at once that might be affecting kestrels. And thinking about that, these different things are probably interacting too. It's probably not just, oh, West Nile virus, and then separately, habitat change. Let's think about habitat change. So if you guys look at the picture on the left, we can see a meadow, a pristine habitat where a kestrel would love to live. You can see there's some dead snags there that the kestrel can nest in. Well, let's say that gets converted into a residential development, right? So now kestrels can't perch on those trees because they're not there. Kestrels also can't forage as effectively because lawns don't have the same amount of insect or rodent prey that a meadow would have. So right there, we have a habitat change that's keeping kestrels from thriving. But also, whenever a residential development comes up, meadow voles are no longer a great species to have around. Instead, people see them as an intruder into their homes and they apply rodenticides. Well, when we apply rodenticides, now kestrels are going to have environmental contaminants introduced into the environment as well. And going hand in hand, there's going to be fewer rodents because we're applying rodenticides in these residential developments. So kestrels will have decreased prey abundance and increased competition for that prey that's left. So not only do they have less prey and it's poisoned, but they're also competing with red tails and other predators that are looking for those small mammals, which is probably going to lead to mortality of some sort, either with fledglings or annual survival of adults. So there's a lot of things that could be causing the kestrel decline. But how are those things impacting the kestrels firsthand? So like I mentioned, we're looking at about 4 different focused primary causes of decline. And we also need to look at the ecological responses that kestrels are putting out for us to see, all the signals that they're showing. These are shown in the way of nest occupancy. Like I said, we have a long-running nest box program, so we can see how nest occupancy fluctuates either over time or in coordination with some other factors. We're also measuring nestlings to look at growth and development. We're tracking fledgling survival and dispersal and looking at adult survival year-round to see how they're doing seasonally. And the great thing about measuring all these things is not only can we look and see how environmental contaminants are impacting development, that's pretty cool, but we can also look at how decreasing prey abundance might be impacting nest occupancy. That's okay too. The greatest thing is that we can look at every single combination of these drivers of decline and the ecological response. So we can look at how habitat cover and land cover changes are impacting nestling growth. We can look at every combination. So this sounds great on paper, but what does this really look like in the field? The first thing we do every season, of course, is to work with our long-term stuff. So we're going to monitor nest boxes every single year. We have 130, so it takes a while. But you can see here, we'll assess if kestrels are occupying the nest box. We'll see if there's eggs, assess hatching, and then move forward from there. Or we'll see if there's competitors, like this little bird here in the right picture. This gives us a good idea of how kestrels are doing population-wise in terms of their breeding populations, as well as allows us to see where chicks are in our nest boxes, which brings us to step 2. As soon as we see that there's chicks in boxes, we're going to start measuring them. So we measure chicks weekly. They usually fledge around 4 weeks old. So we'll measure them when they're 1 week old, 2 and 3 weeks old. And you can see that in the pictures here. So the chick, the tiny little cotton ball on the left, is 7 days old. So still a super tiny chick. It'd be surprising if I said it, but the chick on the right is only 14 days old. So that's a week's worth of growth for a kestrel. And you can see I'm measuring the same thing on both of these birds. So we're measuring, it's called tarsus length. It's pretty much like your elbow to your wrist. And this just gives us an overall idea of bone growth over time. And by measuring them multiple times, I'm able to graph their growth trajectory. So see how every single chick is growing week after week after week while it's in our nest box. And as soon as we're done with measuring those chicks when they're 21 days old, we're also going to be deploying what we call auxiliary markers, which our bander friends know what those are. Ours include color bands as well as transmitters. So you can see our numeric color bands here. We also have alphanumeric color bands, and they're field readable. So we're able to recite birds and know who is who on our landscape. And although color bands are great, the next step in technology is to attach radio transmitters. And over the past 3 years, we've been able to attach over 200 of them and track them to assess survival and dispersal of kestrels. So using both the color bands and transmitters, we're following these chicks not only when they're in the box, but after they leave the box too. On day 21, we're also taking blood samples from which I'm able to screen for contaminants. I screen for over 100 different contaminants, including insecticides, herbicides, rodenticides, and pretty much everything else you can think about as an agricultural chemical. Thinking about outside of the kestrels, because we're thinking about ecological responses, surveying prey abundance is another big thing that we're doing. So looking at all 3 different prey types is part of our goal. First, we're looking at small mammal abundance using what we call track tubes. It's an alternative to the Sherman traps where you trap an animal and then tag it. Instead, our animals aren't tracked at all. They are trying to get to this little ball of peanut butter in the middle, and they have to walk over an ink pad and then paper to get to it. So in that way, I'm able to see their little footprints and assess small mammal abundance without even capturing or bothering the mammals. In fact, they get a little snack out of it. We're also looking at insects. So using a sweep net, we're able to estimate small insect abundance. So we can get grasshoppers, dragonflies, and some beetles as well. And by controlling the amount of distance we're doing at every nest box, we can compare this across sites. And finally, songbird counts. I'm not good at taking pictures of songbirds. I'm sure you guys are, but we're also counting songbirds at sites to estimate abundance of that prey type as well. And thinking about habitat on a larger scale, I also get to have fun in GIS. So there we go. So plotting where our nest boxes are and putting a buffer around that nest box to see what does the land look like around the nest box from an aerial view. Is it mostly cornfields? Do kestrels like soybean fields or meadows? In order to see what we can do in terms of land cover change to help kestrels enjoy our boxes. And something new this year, which is really fun. Those in ecology know that experiments are really tough to have, but we're actually running a Cooper's Hawk playback experiment this year. So the reason for this is that there's a lot of difference within the literature about how people feel Cooper's hawks are impacting kestrels. You can see our top paper here is suspected predation on radio-tracked kestrels by accipiters. This was a study done a couple years ago. Kestrels had transmitters on and they saw Cooper's hawks may be killing them. While the bottom paper here by my friend John Smallwood shows that on a population level, there's no way Cooper's hawks are impacting kestrels. So whenever there's a question in the literature, I like to try to answer it. So what we're doing is putting out a Cooper's hawk dummy and playing Cooper's hawk calls to see exactly how kestrels are behaviorally responding. So you can see this kestrel papa not super happy. So we're looking at the direct behavioral response, such as dive bombing, but we're also looking at, is he hunting less because he's more alert to that Cooper's hawk? And we're comparing our control boxes to ones that herd Cooper's hawks to see if chicks are growing differently and see if they're surviving or leaving the nest box more quickly. So altogether, we are assessing reproductive success by looking at nest boxes. We're measuring the chicks and assessing their growth and development. We're deploying and tracking these auxiliary markers for survival. We're collecting blood samples for contaminants. We're surveying all of the prey abundances that are required by kestrels. And we're running these Cooper's hawk playback experiments. And the best thing is we're doing this all at the same time. So over the past 2 years, we have done all of this. And for every single nest box that's occupied, we know exactly how many small mammals. We know about the insect abundance. We know how the chicks grew, how they survived when they left. So we can really put together all the pieces of the puzzle to figure out what's going on at that box, but then at a population level as well. So like I mentioned, this is all fine and dandy, but in order to really understand what's happening continentally, we need to collaborate and we need to work with other folks to see what's happening at their sites as well. Because we know that different regions probably have different problems. So I'll remind you guys of this slide. While something might be impacting kestrel populations here in the Northeast, we know that kestrels are also declining in the West. So maybe it's something different. So to do this, we wanted to put together a collaborative network, and we started here in the Northeast. So you can see Hawk Mountain Sanctuary right here. So we worked with folks in Pennsylvania. So the PA Game Commission, of course, has 2 of our sites, and we also work with volunteers in Northampton and Lancaster County. But we didn't just stop there, because Pennsylvania is great, but we can go further. So we moved into New Jersey, and we're working with their DEP, Montclair State University, and Duke Farms, which is a great nonprofit for conservation. We moved into Delaware with Brandywine Zoo and Delaware Fish and Wildlife. We're now working with the Smithsonian Institute in Virginia. New York, we're working with Cornell University and a volunteer at St. Lawrence. We're working with Vermont Institute of Natural Sciences in Vermont. UMass Amherst, we're now moving west. We're working with Boise State University, a volunteer in California, and one in Wisconsin who just added in the past 2 weeks. We're as far south as Cape Coral, Florida, and we're as far north as Ontario and Quebec. So really, we've put together a collaborative network, and everyone's replicating the exact same methods I developed, so everyone has comparable data, which is really valuable, and those that put together studies know just how amazing it is to collaborate. So of course, our final goal was to develop and communicate these management plans, right? Because it's great to know what might be impacting kestrels, but how can we help them? So here's the timeline of where we are. So far, we have collected most of our field data and our samples. We're still collecting some extra samples this summer. And we've gone through the waiting for results from our other sites and our labs. So right now we're in the analysis stage, woohoo, which is super exciting. But yeah, so at the moment we're analyzing data, we're writing manuscripts, and we're figuring out how these drivers are correlated or impacting population parameters of kestrels. Once we're done with that, we'll be writing these into full publishable manuscripts, publishing it not only within our collaborative network, but beyond. So everyone is able to go ahead and put into play the management practices that we can recommend based on the results that we have. So how can you guys help? Well, first of all, like I said, we have auxiliary markers. So we have these color bands and these transmitters on kestrels. Most of the transmitters now have dead batteries, but you can still see the antenna wire, like in this picture. So if you guys ever see a color banded kestrel, whether it's on a power line or if it's in one of your nest boxes, please feel free to report it to me, to Hawk Mountain in general. We love finding out where our birds end up. We actually just found out yesterday, one of our birds I banded 2 years ago in Kempton is now at Middle Creek Wildlife Management Area, nesting for the first time. Also, a little more unfortunate, if you guys find a dead kestrel, I'm always interested in collecting those to do a necropsy to figure out the source of mortality, as well as to look at the environmental contaminant load in that bird. We don't know if it's contaminants, but just by looking at the contaminant load in different areas, we can get an idea of what kestrels are going through. And finally, for any of our landowners, maintaining good habitat for kestrels, of course, is an amazing way to help them out. So if you have natural meadow, that's always great. Leaving up dead trees, even though they can be unsightly, is super important for kestrels that may not have a nest box. And if you guys would like to join our Farmland Raptor project, you can talk to me afterwards. We can get you a nest box and get you guys set up. But that's it. A huge thank you to PSO for the student research grant last year. It really excelled this project. And I can take questions now or at the Q&A if we have time. Two questions. Yeah.
Are you looking at considering pest predation as a factor? I went from an agricultural landscape where chemicals are fairly common. Not even trying hard, I've seen pest predation as a big factor. Not talking about black rats.
Definitely. Awesome. Yeah. So the question. Absolutely. So that's a really great question. So the question is about nest predation, how that might be impacting kestrels and how we're assessing it. So we can kind of infer whether there's a nest predation or not based on, if there's cracked eggs. We usually know that it's a starling that's pecked the eggs open, or a black rat snake or other snakes will swallow the eggs whole. So we can guess as to what's happening. The only real way to truly assess that is with nest box cameras. We only have one at the moment, but yeah, it's a great point. And nest box predation happens all over the place. And kestrels are a little protected because the nest box entrance is kind of small, but snakes can definitely get in. Songbirds can get in as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you for the question. Other things, yes.
What area required to support a nesting pair? How big is it?
Awesome. Yeah, great question. So the question is, what area is required for a nesting pair to be supported? We really are not sure. So looking at home range size, it really depends on the resource density. So if there's a lot of food, you don't need a lot of area. At our study site down in Florida, there are so many grasshoppers between one utility pole and the next utility pole. There's one kestrel, and move over one more power line and there's another kestrel. So it really depends on the resources. In terms of nest boxes, we've already had 2 nest boxes on the same 1 acre property. As long as they can't see each other, they seem to be okay. So I would say, if you think your habitat's suitable, let's go ahead and put up a nest box and see what we can get. It can only help. All right, that's it. Cool.